Hey, this is Cynically Speaking. Seen a lot of news articles online recently about the upcoming internment camp, the COVID camp out at a place called WellCamp in Queensland, Australia. Now, as a Brit living in Queensland, this is in my backyard, so it's a little close to home. So, looking at the web's page in front of you now, this is the Wagner Corporation who own the WellCamp Airport. Now, WellCamp itself is a area outside of a town called Toowoomba. Now, this isn't the name of the camp. This is in no way in relation to COVID. WellCamp Airport itself was actually created in 2012 to 2014. Um, Look, it was built within 2 years, which for an airport is phenomenal. However, that's beside the point. The point is that all these news articles talking about how this quarantine camp is it's well camp, it's propaganda, it's this, it's that. It's actually not. This is an area that was actually already earmarked for the airport. It's known as WellCamp Airport. It has been for nearly a decade. That being said, the quarantine facility that the Wagner Corporation, and specifically there's a family called the Wagners who own the corporation, these guys are going to be making the quarantine facility next to the airport. And when I say next to the airport, I mean next to the airport. There's the main strip there. And I'm assuming this area here, because this is the terminal here, this area here is the development for the the quarantine facility. This quarantine facility is supposed to be housing 1,000 people. Now, whether or not it's going to hit capacity or whatnot is beside the point. Um, this quarantine facility is actually supposed to take the burden off the hotel sector that is now housing people who are under their 2 week mandatory quarantine when entering the country. Look, people say it's hard to get into the country. It is. But if and when you do come in, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks at your expense. So this, I'm assuming, should be a conduit for, I don't know, Brisbane Airport, Sydney Airport, Melbourne Airport. So as soon as you enter the country, you will facilitate and quarantine at one of these quarantine facilities dotted around the country. I know there's one in the Northern Territory. I know, obviously, this one that's being built and earmarked to be completed by the end of this year. And I'm assuming there's going to be one in every state. Um, let's also keep in mind that the the pandemic should burn out at some point, if not become endemic. That's a conversation for another time. But what is happening here is these quarantine facilities are being made, and are we to assume that they're going to be here longer than the year, 2 years from now? Who knows? Who knows? But there's obviously a lot of money being banded around in regards to these quarantine facilities. Um, this is the mandatory supervised quarantine for repatriated Australians. So this is what I was talking about, the Northern Territory current facility. This is what it costs per individual when being repatriated back into Australia for Australians who have been abroad. And this is mandatory for 14 days. Now, for a family, obviously they can share accommodation, but that is still $5,000 per fortnight. Now, if at the end of the term you refuse to take a test, you will stay, and I'm sure that is not optional, for an additional 10 days, charged at a daily rate. Now, if we take that rate for an extra 10 days, that's going to be approximately 1,800 Australian dollars. Insane amounts of money. So, when we're talking about WellCamp and we're talking about the Wagner Corporation, this is not an altruistic endeavor. This is a money-making endeavor, pure and simple, and it always will be. And I'm not opposed to capitalism in any way, but when you're doing that on the backs of people that are mandated to do something, that to me is an essence of crony capitalism. Now, Wagner, the corporation, are not going to be running the facility at WellCamp. I believe that they're making it, they're supplying the land, but it's the Queensland government that are going to be running this thing. Now, if anybody has seen the documentary regarding McDonald's and the movie The Founder with Michael Keaton, they'll know that McDonald's don't make their money from the franchises in a traditional way for the most part. They own the land that McDonald's are built on. I believe, I believe that this is the model that Wagner's have incorporated for this quarantine facility. And we've had news articles, obviously this is ABC Australia, talking about how the Coof quarantine facility at WellCamp will work. This is our Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk and John Wagner, obviously the owner of the Wagner Corporation, along with his siblings. And who will go in the site? It's all pretty clear cut. We know who's going to go in the site. This is going to be repatriated Australians initially. But, and this is my concern, and this is going to venture into slippery slope fallacy territory. What happens if it starts to run rife in Australia? What happens if we have households of people who are unfortunately stricken down with COVID, who have or have not had the vaccine? Again, conversation for another time. They're going to be shipped into this facility. Now, currently, it is just an airport. So, obviously, any people that have been brought into this facility are going to have to come in by air. That alone has its own complications. But, oh, and this is the facility in the Northern Territory. This, to me, is worrisome. My concern is, why can't people stay at home with family and loved ones? To be segregated into a facility like this has very eerie similarities with the past. Again, I'm not going to go into Godwin's law with this one, but it's kind of scary. So this was the initial joint statement between Anastasia Palaszczuk, the Deputy Premier Stephen Michaels, and our Health Minister. And I'll leave that up on the screen so you can quickly read that yourself. But basically, they're going on the lines of, we need this facility urgently, and the WellCamp proposal will be ready in months before any other proposal facility in Queensland. So there are multiple properties in Queensland that are being proposed for a quarantine facility. So what they're hoping is that this will open up the country and avoid lockdowns. Now, how are they going to do that? If there is community spread, again, my assertion is that any Australians within the country that contract this will more than likely be shipped to this quarantine facility. Again, segregating them from family, loved ones, to be in a very very scary environment, I would think. You've got medical staff around you that are practically in hazmat suits, that you don't know if you're going to see your family again. This is worrisome. So, that being said, let's update this, shall we? These are the total cases for Australia up to and including the 20th of September. I bring this up because this is where we are in the realms of either wanting or needing quarantine facilities. Quarantine facilities are there so that I'm assuming the most vulnerable and the most ill among us are probably shipped to. Now, I'm going to gloss over the cases because cases have a variation between probably a slight cough that's had a PCR test and has had a positive PCR test, right up to probably the worst cases where somebody's on a ventilator, in hospital, in the ICU. So cases to me can be a little bit hit and miss. If you wanted to divvy those up, you could do. But when looking at the deaths per state and the deaths on the country as a whole, Queensland itself has had 7. Not 700, not 70, not 7,000. 7. And the country as a whole has had just over 1,000. Now, every one of those is a tragedy, and I'm not going to deny that. People getting sick and dying is terrible, but I dare say there are other things on this earth that people get sick and or die from every day that aren't scrutinized as closely as this. Now, I didn't want this channel to be a COVID channel. I wanted to talk about stuff that interested me. This is something that I feel I need to talk about because I have a family who I care for dearly, and these sort of moves by governments, not just the one I'm living in now in a country that I absolutely adore, but governments around the world are making moves along these lines, and it worries me. Now, looking at the states and territories of Australia, I'm just going to break it down to population areas first. Now, looking at the populations, we have the third largest population in the Australian Union, just over 5 million people. Remember those 7 deaths. So we've got 5 million plus people in Queensland. Now, looking at the area that Queensland covers, it's the second largest in area per square kilometre, and we've the third largest population by state and territory, with 7 deaths, and we're talking about quarantine camps. This is madness. This is sheer madness. There must be a more effective and humane way to deal with these people. I don't know what the answer is. I don't claim to know what the answers are. I'm just observing what is in front of me. And what is in front of me looks terrifying. Let me know what you think. Am I jumping off the deep end? am I close to the mark? But the misinformation at the beginning, which kind of flagged this for me, is the hyperbole around it being called WellCamp. Now you can see that's just not true. But the rest of it, the rest of everything I've talked about here, the facility, the Wagners, the price per individual that's going to be coming into these facilities. And obviously, this is just a guide from the Northern Territory one. Could that be more? Could that be less? The government obviously working hand in hand with the Wagner Corporation. This just screams crony capitalism to me. More money being funneled into massive corporations for a case rate in single figures, single digits. Anyway, speak to you soon.